Muito bom dia a vocês que estão conosco nesse terceiro dia de seminário em diálogo com o pensamento de Paul Tillich. Quero saudar vocês que vêm estando conosco aí desde o início, né, desse programa, que é a primeira parte do seminário. A gente tem uma segunda parte prevista para a próxima semana, o GT Paul Tillich, que acontecerá no âmbito do Congresso Nacional da AMPTEC, que é a Associação de Programas de Pós-Graduação em Ciência da Religião e Teologia, né? O site do Congresso, a gente vai colocar no decorrer desse programa, ou da programação de hoje, nós vamos colocar o site à disposição nos comentários, para vocês poderem ainda fazer a sua inscrição, para participar, ao menos como ouvintes, né? E quem tem, eventualmente, entre nós já aqui, comunicação inscrita, vai receber nos próximos dias um e-mail com orientações, tá bem? Inclusive com a programação atualizada, né? A programação que está no site não é a programação efetiva do nosso GT. Mas estamos hoje aqui, no terceiro dia do seminário, com a previsão aí de tratarmos do tema Teologia, Religião e Cultura, reflexões sobre a teologia sistemática conforme Paul Tillich, né? E antes de a gente entrar no mérito temático e apresentar a mesa, eu gostaria, saudando vocês que estão conosco, participando de vários contextos aí do Brasil e de fora do Brasil, porque hoje temos uma programação internacional conosco aqui, né? E eu queria fazer essa observação, primeiro para registrar que, feliz ou infelizmente, nas condições da pandemia, a gente aprendeu a se valer dessa tecnologia que nós estamos usando aqui para transcender algumas fronteiras, né? Então, a gente está contando com a contribuição hoje de um dos professores críticos, estudiosos de Tillich, que mais tem produzido nos últimos anos, né? E é uma contribuição singular para a recepção, para o aprimoramento, para a qualificação da recepção de Tillich no nosso país, né? Esse é o objetivo da Sociedade Paul Tillich com essa programação. E ainda que nós tenhamos os desafios, né, das fronteiras interculturais que nos obrigam a interagir em línguas que não são as nossas línguas mães. Então, o professor Danz, que vai ser apresentado em seguida, reside em Viena, é professor na Universidade de Viena, e vai se esforçar em conversar com a gente em inglês, que não é a língua mãe dele, e nós vamos também viver um pouco esse deslocamento, né? Como foi divulgado anteriormente, nós teremos a palestra principal em inglês, né? Não teremos tradução simultânea, o texto será projetado, como a gente tem feito nas outras sessões, e as interações acontecerão aí com a mediação do professor Fábio Henrique Abreu, em português e inglês, quer dizer, bilíngue, né? E lembrando que esse material todo permanece no YouTube, no canal da Sociedade Paul Tillich do Brasil, que é importante para nós que vocês sigam e que vocês interajam conosco por lá também. E esse material fica lá gravado para posteriores consultas, para uso e reuso, né, nos nossos estudos em Tillich, em solo brasileiro. Então, fazendo essa palavra, agradecendo a vocês novamente, e agradecendo aí todo o pessoal da Sociedade Paul Tillich do Brasil, que está conosco aqui na plataforma, nos bastidores, a gente segue agora com a programação prevista. Muito obrigado.
Muito bom dia a todas e todos. Eu também gostaria de saudá-los e afirmar que somos imensamente gratos pela presença de cada um de vocês nessa nossa última conferência do seminário da Sociedade Paul Tillich do Brasil. Sou o professor Dr. Fábio Henrique Abreu, sou pesquisador de habilitação em teologia sistemática pela Universidade de Viena. Atuo nessa instituição sob a supervisão de nosso palestrante dessa manhã, o já referido professor Dr. Christian Danz, com quem tenho um vínculo acadêmico, intelectual e de amizade desde meu estágio pós-doutoral realizado entre os anos de 2015 e 2016 na Universidade Federal de Juiz de Fora, sob a supervisão do ilustríssimo professor Dr. Eduardo Roos, e em Viena, sob a supervisão do professor Christian Danz. Meu vínculo acadêmico e profissional com o professor Danz continua na medida em que fui oficialmente aceito, em maio de 2018, como pesquisador de habilitação pela Faculdade de Teologia Evangélica da Universidade de Viena. Gostaria muitíssimo de, em nome da Sociedade Paul Tillich do Brasil e de seu presidente, o professor Dr. Etienne Guer, saudar imensamente a cada um de vocês pela presença e participação em nosso evento, que é o 25º Seminário em Diálogo com Pensamento de Paul Tillich. Saúdo também aos professores, colegas e amigos da Sociedade Paul Tillich do Brasil, que se encontram nessa plataforma conosco nessa manhã. Esse evento conta com a participação da Universidade Federal de Sergipe, da Universidade Metodista de São Paulo e da Universidade Federal de Juiz de Fora. To our international listeners and friends, I kindly ask for a little patience as I introduce the guests to our conference this morning in Portuguese. Na mediação da mesa de hoje, tenho uma enorme satisfação de contar com a presença do professor e amigo Dr. Jonas Roos. Vou pedir ao professor Joey Marçal para que possamos trazê-lo à tela. Já está na tela. Que é professor associado no Departamento de Ciência da Religião da Universidade Federal de Juiz de Fora. O professor Jonas Roos é especialista no pensamento do filósofo dinamarquês Søren Kierkegaard, possui diversas obras publicadas sobre esse autor, além também de ser um exímio conhecedor do pensamento de Tillich. O professor Jonas tem licenciatura em filosofia pela Universidade do Vale do Rio dos Sinos, Unicinos, mestrado em teologia pelo Instituto Ecumênico de Pós-Graduação das Faculdades ESH, doutorado em teologia pela mesma instituição, com período sanduíche no Søren Kierkegaard Research Center, em Copenhague, na Dinamarca, e pós-doutorado em filosofia pela Unicinos. Tem experiência nas áreas de filosofia, teologia e ciência da religião, com ênfase em filosofia da religião, teologia sistemática e antropologia filosófica. Muitíssimo obrigado, Jonas, por aceitar o convite para estar conosco nessa mesa. Nessa manhã, teremos uma honrosa preleção proferida pelo presidente da Deutsche Paul Tillich Gesellschaft, Sociedade Paul Tillich da Alemanha, o já mencionado professor Christian Danz, que muito prontamente aceitou o nosso convite para discorrer sobre os contornos e limites, sobretudo os limites da teologia de Paul Tillich. Enquanto nossos participantes e ouvintes vão chegando e se aproximando de nosso canal de transmissão pelo YouTube, eu gostaria de comentar rapidamente sobre o nosso seminário. O seminário tem como título Religião, Linguagem e Cultura, relevância e limites da teologia da cultura de Paul Tillich para o século XXI. A estrutura de nosso evento, como vocês puderam ver no site e no flyer que circulamos por meio de inúmeros canais e redes, foi dividida, podemos assim dizer, em 4 grandes encontros. Tivemos um primeiro encontro, dia 15 de setembro, com uma palestra por mim proferida sob o título Bases Conceituais da Teologia da Cultura. Todos esses encontros estão gravados, estão disponíveis no site da Sociedade Paul Tillich do Brasil, no YouTube. Na noite do dia 20 de setembro, tivemos a honra de contar com a palestra do presidente de nossa sociedade, o já referido professor Dr. Etienne Guer, intitulada Saúde e Salvação em Tillich na perspectiva da teologia da cultura. Nessa manhã, teremos a honrosa palestra do professor Christian Danz, sob o título Theology, Religion, Culture, Reflections on the Task of Systematic Theology Following Paul Tillich, que será proferida, conforme anunciado, em inglês. Infelizmente, não temos a possibilidade de oferecer tradução simultânea ou mesmo consecutiva. A palestra, bem como o debate subsequente, serão realizados em língua inglesa. Mas, por favor, não se assustem. Faremos o máximo para nos tornar compreensíveis, mesmo para aqueles que possuem um nível bastante básico de conhecimento da língua inglesa. E, afinal de contas, nosso inglês, né? Nosso inglês que não é nossa língua materna. Por fim, o quarto grande encontro de nosso seminário será realizado entre os dias 28 e 30 de setembro, em nosso grupo de trabalho Paul Tillich, no âmbito do 8º Congresso da ANPTECRI, Associação Nacional de Pós-Graduação e Pesquisa em Teologia e Ciências da Religião. Embora a conferência dessa manhã seja a última conferência, é importante relembrá-los de que nos encontraremos novamente na ANPTECRI, onde as numerosas comunicações enviadas ao nosso GT, comunicações enviadas por de várias partes de nosso país, onde essas comunicações poderão ser apresentadas e discutidas em ambiente próprio. Então, como já temos um número satisfatório de visitantes e participantes aqui conosco, podemos, sem mais delongas, iniciar o evento dessa manhã oficialmente. Eu gostaria de convidar o professor Dr. Christian Danz para a nossa tela, a fim de apresentá-lo a nossos ouvintes e participantes. Sehr geehrter Herr Professor Dr. Christian Danz, vielen Dank, dass Sie heute Morgen bei uns sind. Und diesen brasilianischen Morgen meine ich natürlich. Und vielen Dank, dass Sie unsere bescheidene Einladung so freundlich angenommen haben. Es ist eine große Ehre, Sie hier zu haben. Im Namen der brasilianischen Paul Tillich Gesellschaft möchte ich Ihnen aufrichtig für Ihre Teilnahme und Ihren Beitrag danken. Bitte gestatten Sie mir, Sie unserem Publikum auf Portugiesisch vorzustellen. Ich bin gleich wieder bei Ihnen. Okay? Also lassen Sie mich Sie daher ganz kurz, und ich meine wirklich ganz kurz, vorstellen. O professor Christian Danz é teólogo alemão radicado em Viena. Em 99, foi Privatdozent de Teologia Sistemática na Faculdade de Teologia da Universidade de Viena, onde realizou toda a sua formação teológica. De 2000 a 2002, atuou como professor substituto de Teologia Sistemática na Universidade de Essen. E desde o semestre de verão de 2002, trabalha como professor efetivo de Teologia Sistemática na Faculdade de Teologia Evangélica da Universidade de Viena. Desde março de 2002, é ministro ordenado pela Igreja Evangélica Luterana em Thüringen. De 2004 a 2006, atuou como vice-presidente da Sociedade Paul Tillich da Alemanha e, desde 2006, ocupa a presidência dessa sociedade. É membro, desde 2009, da Comissão de Publicação das Obras Críticas e Histórico-Filosóficas de Schelling, vinculada à Academia de Ciências da Baviera. Também é editor das obras suplementares e escritos de espólio de Paul Tillich, os Ergänzungs- und Nachlassbände, que hoje contam com 20 volumes, além de tradutor de várias obras de Tillich do inglês para o alemão, incluindo a tradução revisada da Teologia Sistemática estadunidense. Autor prolífico, o professor Danz conta em seu currículo com, literalmente, não figurativamente, literalmente, centenas de publicações, incluindo ao menos 12 densos livros de autoria exclusiva, mais de 150 livros como organizador, mais de 300 capítulos de livros publicados e mais de 200 artigos científicos publicados em periódicos extremamente qualificados. Entre suas contribuições mais importantes, gostaria de citar apenas algumas poucas que dizem respeito mais diretamente ao tema que será discutido nessa manhã. Em 96, ele publicou sua tese de doutorado sob o título A Cristologia Filosófica de Schelling. No ano de 2002, ele publicou sua tese de habilitação, Religião como Consciência da Liberdade, um estudo da teologia como teoria das condições constitutivas da da subjetividade individual por Paul Tillich. No ano de 2005, ele publicou 2 livros, Introdução à Teologia das Religiões e Deus e a Liberdade Humana, estudos sobre o conceito de Deus na modernidade. No ano de 2007, publicou o livro O Deus Real, Efetivo, sobre a história de um conceito teológico fundamental. No ano de 2008, publicou o livro A Interpretação da Religião na Cultura, Tarefas e Problemas da Teologia na Era do Pluralismo Religioso. No ano de 2010, publicou o livro Introdução à Dogmática Evangélica. Em 2013, ele publicou um denso estudo sobre os problemas fundamentais da cristologia. Também no ano de 2013, publicou um livro intitulado Introdução à Teologia de Martinho Lutero. Em 2016, publicou seu esboço programático de uma teologia sistemática. Em 2018, ele publica seu livro que apresenta seu próprio sistema teológico sistemático, intitulado O Espírito de Deus, uma pneumatologia. No ano de 2020, publicou um livro sobre o Jesus histórico e o Cristo da fé, intitulado Jesus de Nazaré entre judaísmo e cristianismo, um esboço cristológico e teológico religioso. E, ainda nesse ano, publicou o livro sobre as deidades da samocrácia de Schelling em contexto. É com imensa honra, pois, que gostaria de dar as boas-vindas ao professor Christian Danz, que gentilmente se dispôs a estar conosco nessa manhã e tarde de Viena, discutindo uma temática de ímpar relevância não apenas para um estudo exegético de Paul Tillich, mas também para a superação dos limites de seu pensamento a partir da fundamentação de um novo programa teológico sistemático, o qual ele vem desenvolvendo ao longo dos últimos 5 anos e que demarca a originalidade e autonomia de sua reflexão teológico-sistemática. Após a preleção do professor Danz, a palavra será aberta para uma breve reação dos membros desta mesa, a saber, eu e o professor Dr. Jonas Roos, nessa ordem. Em seguida, acolheremos as perguntas e comentários levantados por nossos ouvintes e participantes que nos acompanham nessa manhã. Portanto, sintam-se livres para e encorajados a postar suas questões por meio do chat do YouTube. Faremos o possível para traduzi-las, caso seja necessário. Assim, senhoras e senhores, sem mais demoras, recebam comigo o professor Christian Danz. Professor Danz, thank you very much again. Please make yourself at home. We welcome you and are eager to listen to your presentation. As we say here in Brazil, aber natürlich nicht auf Deutsch, das Wort gehört ganz Ihnen. Oder auf Português, a palavra é toda sua. Thank you again and welcome.
Thank you very much. Dear Fábio, thank you for your kindly introduction and for the invitation to your meeting in Brazil. It is a great pleasure for me and a great honor to be with you at your meeting this year. Thank you so much for the invitation. Paul Tillich's theology is one of the most important and influential conceptions of the 20th century. In particular, his theology of culture has exercised a broad fascination with his work and virtually become his trademark. This includes the thesis that religion is a substance of culture, and culture is a form of religion. It aims at enabling a religious interpretation of reality as a whole. In his theology of culture, which Tillich elaborated above all after the First World War, he took up fundamental motives of the so-called modern positive theology of his teachers Adolf Schlatter and Wilhelm Lütgert. These motives become visible above all in the criticism of soteriological theological concepts, namely of limitations of God's revelation to Jesus Christ, which can be found in Tillich's complete works. With Schlatter and Lütgert, Tillich assumes a general revelation of God in creation and places the revelation of God in Christ within this framework. Tillich's reception of German idealism, namely the philosophies of Fichte and Schelling in the period before World War I, must be understood in this problem historical context. Tillich is concerned with a better epistemological critical grounding of modern positive theology. Also, Tillich's relationship to the new theologies elaborated after World War I by Friedrich Gogarten and Karl Barth can only be understood in terms of his having been influenced by the modern positive theologies of his academic teachers. For with the dialectical theologians, Tillich shares the view that God is strictly transcendent and distinct from the world. There is no way to God from human beings. Knowledge of God is consistently bound to God's revelation. Tillich's difference to Barth and Gogarten does not lie, therefore, in the concept of revelation, but in its version. Tillich opposes the restriction of God's revelation to Christ with the assertion of a general revelation of creation. Tillich's theology of culture, which we will deal with in the following under the guiding terms theology, religion, culture, results from his version of the concept of revelation. In order to explore the significance of his conception for the debates in the 21st century, we have to turn to the construction as well as the structural elements of his theology. Only after this has been done, and we have formed an image of the systematic foundation of his theology, we can name its limits and pursue the questions in relation to which form Tillich's idea of a theology of culture can be continued under the conditions of the 21st century. In doing so, it will become clear that Tillich's foundation of a theology of culture on the basis of a general concept of religion cannot be continued under the conditions of a pluralistic culture and society. Rather, it must be replaced by a conception that pays more attention to the differences and distinctions of religions. Only in this way can a theology of culture be elaborated under the conditions of the present time, which then, of course, also acquires a quite different function from that developed by Tillich himself. The structure of my remarks results from the question just indicated about the significance of Tillich's theology of culture for our present. I will begin with a look at the systematic foundations of Tillich's theology of culture. I will limit myself here primarily to his 1919 draft Justification and Doubt, which offers the first detailed systematic unfolding of a theology of culture that forms, as it were, the background of Tillich's famous lecture on the idea of a theology of culture from the same year. As we will see, Tillich retains the systematic grounding he elaborated in the 1919 draft, except for a few modifications all the way to his late systematic theology. In the second section, we will deal with the systematic problems of Tillich's theology of culture, which primarily concerns his concept of religion. In order to resolve these difficulties, I will present a proposal for a redefinition of religion that rejects a general concept of religion as advocated by Tillich. On this basis, a reformulation of a systematic theology of culture can then be indicated in the concluding third section. Such a reformulation takes up Tillich's intention, but gives it not only a different justification, but also a different direction. Firstly, Paul Tillich's theology of culture and its revelation theological foundations. From the very beginning, Paul Tillich's theology is concerned with establishing the possibility of a religious interpretation of reality. The writings from the time before the First World War, his two dissertations on Schelling, as well as the systematic theology of 1913, already elaborate such a theological program. This theological program is developed by means of recourse to a speculative philosophies of Fichte and Schelling in order to give an epistemological critical grounding to the so-called modern positive theology. Schlutter's empirical theology, which starts from the realist assumption that God as a cause and unity of the world always already underlies everything concrete in it, transfers Tillich into a speculative conception of theology that understands the relation of God and the world as a relation between absolute and particular spirit. The universe is a process in which God grasps himself in the world he has created and at the same time distinguishes himself from it. Tillich transformed this speculative conception during the First World War. The most striking difference from the pre-war theology is that now the present as well as the concrete in history becomes the focus of Tillich's theology, and the speculative framework of a history of the absolute is dropped. The first comprehensive elaboration of this new theological conception is found in the draft Justification and Doubt. Tillich had written it in 1919 in order to introduce himself to the theological faculty of the University of Berlin, to which he rehabilitated himself after the war. What is the draft Justification and Doubt about? In this text, Tillich elaborates a foundation of theology that aims to accommodate the modern culture based on autonomy. The keywords justification and doubt stand for this. Quote, "It is to be shown that the principle of Protestantism contains in itself a moment through the unfolding of which it comes into unity with the spiritual life built on autonomy." End of quote. Critical subjectivity, that is, the knowledge that every content is posited and produced by human and consequently can be taken back becomes part of the theological foundation. Thus, the critic of religion is included in the foundation of theology. Every thought of God, Tillich assumes, is a thought produced by human. How does he now construct his theological foundation, which on the one hand takes up the religion-critical objections of modernity and on the other hand overcomes them? Tillich bases his post-World War theology on a redefinition of consciousness that functions as a general foundational structure. This means that consciousness as a reflexive and self-referential disclosedness is the origin and basis of all theoretical and practical realities in consciousness. Tillich refers to consciousness, which is a precondition and basis of all concrete acts of consciousness, and the unconditioned, and defines it more specifically as meaning. Thus, the unconditioned already underlies all reality and every reference of consciousness to reality as well as every individual in it, as an infinite reflexivity to which all concrete determinations and contents owe themselves. The unconditioned is itself indeterminate and unrepresentable. It is, in a strict sense, transcendent and permanently distinguished from the world. There is no way from the conditioned to the unconditioned, although it, the unconditioned, always already underlies the reality of the world. The unconditioned is, as it is said in the writings of the 1920s, at the same time ground and abyss. From the world, there is no way to grasp the unconditioned, because all contents of the consciousness are, as contents, products of the consciousness, and therefore not the unconditioned, which is neither a content nor an object. The unconditioned can only be disclosed to human. Tillich determines the contingent disclosedness of the general basic function of consciousness in the individual consciousness as religion. Its general determination is to be an act of intention or directedness towards the unconditioned. How is Tillich's concept of religion being intention of the unconditioned, to be understood? Religion arises in human by the fact that the unconditioned, which is already laid out in the consciousness, disclosed to him. This is bound to an act of reflection in the self-relation of consciousness, which itself is undetermined. Only in this act is the unconditioned given in the consciousness. Tillich explicitly rules out religion as a particular form and function of consciousness. His concept of religion aims precisely at overcoming the idea that religion is a special form in culture among other cultural forms. Thus, it only remains to understand the accessibility of the unconditioned in individual consciousness as negation of the particular consciousness or the particular cultural functions of consciousness. Thus, the revelation theological foundations of Tillich's concept of religion are named. Religion as a directedness towards the unconditioned, arises in human as a contingent act in the self-relation of consciousness. In this act, which cannot be produced by human, the general foundational function of consciousness is disclosed in consciousness. Since the unconditioned is itself indeterminate and therefore cannot be any content or object, it can only present itself as a negation of the contentual determinations of consciousness. Tillich's concept of religion as intention of the unconditioned, results from this structure. The unconditioned, precisely because it itself is no content, can only be represented as a negation of the contentual determinations of consciousness. With the concept of religion sketched so far, the foundations of the theological principle which takes doubt into itself is derived. For faith, as Tillich states, is the affirmation of the absolute paradox, namely, as we have seen, the grasping of the unconditioned as a precondition of all acts of consciousness, which can only be represented as critical negation, namely as doubt. Doubt, which has become reflexive, does not abolish standing in truth, but it is a form of how the unconditioned alone can be grasped. This, as it were, justification theological construction of faith has consequences. I would like to mention two of these consequences before we can turn in the next session to the systematic problems stemming from Tillich's theology of culture. The first aspect to mention concerns the relationship between religion and culture, as well as a resulting version of the contents of religion. As mentioned, religion is for Tillich neither a special function of consciousness nor a special act. It is determined solely by the intention to be directedness towards the unconditioned. That is, it can be represented by all contents of consciousness, since all religious contents are only representation of the event of disclosedness of consciousness in regard to the unconditioned already claimed by it. Thus, every apprehension of the reflexive disclosedness of the unconditioned in consciousness, which as representation is always an image produced by consciousness, is culture. Religious, in contrast to culture, these images are religious only by the fact that they, as representations of the disclosedness of consciousness, can express it disclosedness only as negation. For the religious objects, namely God, this means that they are constructed by Tillich in a self-referential way. They represent and structure in consciousness the reflexive disclosedness of consciousness. By referring to God, religious consciousness refers to itself, namely to its unconditional dimension. This is precisely the content of Tillich's formula of the God above God, which forms already in justification and doubt the key concept of his theology. This God above God does not refer to an actual God beyond the images of God. Rather, it designates the reflexive structure of the act of faith that is represented in it. At the same time, this designates the content of Tillich's symbol theory, which he which he did not elaborate until the 1920s. Fundamental to Tillich's understanding of symbols is not their referential character. That is, that symbols refer to something else. Rather, the symbol is about the position of consciousness in relation to its contents. Consciousness is at its where itself already distinguished by symbolicity. Secondly, we have to take another look at Tillich's revelation theological construction of religion. In order to overcome the opposition of religion and culture, the event of the reflexive disclosedness of the unconditioned in individual consciousness cannot be a particular or determined act, but only an indeterminate one. How must this act be imagined, in which there is a transition from the culture which by its turn is implicitly based on the unconditioned to religion as an explicit intention of the unconditioned? For if in this transition the unconditioned is to be made accessible to consciousness, then consciousness must have a knowledge of it. Otherwise, it could not even know that the unconditioned is not representable. Tillich, however, tends to pass over the question of how religion arises in the individual by answering it by pointing out that the unconditioned is already given in every consciousness. In doing so, however, he passes over a fundamental problem of his construction with silence. It is not really solved even in the further development of his theology from the 1920s up to the American systematic theology. What changes in Tillich's revelation theological foundation of theology between the early draft justification and doubt and systematic theology is above all the introduction of the distinction between a basic revelation and salvation revelation in the lecture Justification and Doubt of 1924. With it, he differentiates the concept of revelation in order to be able to better account for its concreteness. By basic revelation is to be understood a general disclosedness of consciousness, which, however, remains ambiguous. The basic revelation is completed in the Christological revelation of salvation, in which the ambiguity of the basic revelation is overcome by the fact that the consciousness of revelation itself becomes reflexive. This means that the reflexive disclosedness of the unconditioned in consciousness, which can only present itself as negation of the determination of consciousness in it, is itself to be negated again. Even in this further development of his theology, Tillich holds to the general structure of the concept of revelation that we have discussed. What is important about this distinction, I would like to point out, is that Tillich dropped the terminology of basic revelation and salvation revelation in the 1930s in the United States and replaced it with a dialectical interrelation of question and answer. The background of the later method of correlation, as it is significant for the late systematic theology and its structure, is the concept of revelation. Secondly, from the general concept of religion to the diversity of the religious. In his theology of culture, as we have seen, Tillich starts from a theological understanding of revelation, or in Tillich's own words, a metalogical or theonomic understanding of religion. In religion, namely in the directedness towards the unconditioned, the general basic structure of consciousness is disclosed to the individual consciousness. This disclosedness is realized in consciousness as a negation of the contextual determinations produced by consciousness, since the unconditioned itself is not representable. Religion and culture are connected with this. Religion is the explicit knowledge of that presupposition which is already given and claimed in all consciousness, and so therefore also in cultural consciousness, namely the unconditioned. In the interest of the generality of religion, Tillich vehemently refuses to determine the content of the happening of religion itself. This is determined solely by its intentionality, namely to be directedness towards the unconditioned. As intentionality, religion is not directed to any object or content, for it consists precisely in the negation of every content, given that, as already mentioned, the unconditioned as a basis of all determined contents is itself no content. Tillich's concept of religion, as we have tried to make it clear to us, forms the basis of his theology of culture. At the same time, however, this concept of religion is confronted with problems that make it in need of revision given the plural culture of the 21st century. There are three problems in particular that confront Tillich's grounding of theology. First, Tillich holds to a general or universal concept of religion. Wherever a religion arises in human, it consists in the reflexive disclosedness of consciousness, namely in the directedness towards the unconditioned, or as the later formula reads, in that which concerns us ultimately or unconditionally. Just like Jesus Christ, the symbol bearers of other religions are only illustrations of the general structure of religion, which underlies every historical religion. Secondly, connected with this concept of religion is that religion as a directedness towards the unconditioned endows a new unity of the differentiated, fragmented modern culture. This new unity of culture lies below the opposites of the juxtaposed cultural systems, like economy, law, politics, art, and so on. Religion can only create a new unity of culture if it is not itself a special form of culture next to others. This is the reason why Tillich dissolves an autonomous religion as a form of its own. For its generality can only be held on to if it itself is not determined, consequently undetermined. And finally, Tillich's concept of religion leads thirdly to the fact that non-religious ways of life are actually not possible at all. The unconditioned, as we have seen, underlies all consciousness. If someone is not religious or claims to be so, then his own self-understanding is deficient, since he has not come to an adequate understanding of himself, because this closeness of the consciousness and with it a self-understanding of human being exists only as religion. Such a general concept of religion as Tillich based his theology of culture on is no longer convincing in a plural culture and society. For first, a general concept of religion cancels out the diversity and plurality of historical religions. All religions have an identical invariant core. Only their surface, namely the symbolic forms in which they present themselves, are different. But these symbolic forms are insignificant as a shell compared to the actual religious core, which is identical. Secondly, such a model of unity that grounds Tillich's theology of culture and the claim connected with which that aims to give a new justification for the unity of the differentiated culture is under the condition of present culture and society mere romanticism. And finally, thirdly, in a plural culture characterized by high-grade differentiations as the assertion of an anthropological necessity of religion as constructed by Tillich is a mere non-verifiable postulate. It serves only to assert the generality of religion and leads to the fact that non-religious self-understandings cannot be recognized as justified modes of self-description by theology. But if that was the case, then theology would also not be able to recognize the modern plural world. In order to hold on Tillich's idea of the theology of culture and to continue it under the conditions of the 21st century, as has become clear, this general concept of religion must be dropped, as well as his construction of religion. Unlike Tillich, religion is to be assumed as an autonomous form in culture, which has differentiated itself as a separate realm in the process of cultural evolution. Religion is thus not a component of the conditio humana or of the general basic structure of consciousness as in Tillich, but a contingent product of the process of cultural differentiation. As such, it is not necessary for human being and his understanding of himself or his self-understanding. This means that a general concept of religion is to be abandoned by systematic theology, and the concept of religion is to be limited to the Christian religion. The theological concept of religion serves to conceptually grasp and determine Christianity as religion. By renouncing a general concept of religion, the possibility is created to recognize that other religions understand religion differently than Christianity. Thus, it is not a matter of distinguishing only Christianity as a religion or of an understanding it as true and proper religion, but just the other way around, to include in theology and to acknowledge that what is religion is already differently determined in the different religions. Each religion is a religion sui generis, and not merely the historical particularization of a general underlying essence that they allegedly have in common. Now, how is religion to be determined in contrast to Tillich? My proposal is to understand the Christian religion as an independent form of communication in culture, which knows about itself as religion and communicates religion in its contextual communication. Christian religion is an event involved in communication, which consists in the religious use of communication by people. It arises solely in communication and not through preconditions that are given outside of it, such as a religious disposition in the subject or an already existing religious object. Constitutive for the Christian religion is an interrelation of three structural elements. First, it depends on Christian religious communication, namely the memory of Jesus Christ, which must already exist in culture. Second, Christian religion depends on the understanding appropriation of the memory of Jesus Christ. And third, on the symbolic articulation of the appropriated memory of Jesus Christ. As a religion, Christian religion arises alone from all three moments together. It cannot be traced back or justified on one of these elements. Only by people taking up the Christian religious communication as religion and using it for the representation of religion, the Christian religion exists. This depends exclusively on the use that people make of the communication. Religious contents and a religious subject, therefore, exist only in the Christian religion, but not as preconditions from which it could be derived or justified. With the outlined concept of religion, which refers to the Christian religion, the redefinition of religion as a non-derivable act in the self-relationship of consciousness undertaken by Tillich and the theology of the early 20th century is taken up and continued. In that, on the one hand, Tillich's general basic structure has been dropped, and on the other hand, the specificity of religion is not attached to its act alone. In its place, an understanding of the Christian religion as a self-referential, self-aware, and structured communication event takes place. This concept of religion has to be developed by systematic theology. What this means for a continuation of Tillich's theology of culture, we must now finally take a look at. Thirdly, Tillich's systematic theology as a science of the Christian religion. Already Tillich was the opinion that it is not the task of the systematic theology to establish the Christian religion. Rather, it is a task of theology to unfold the Christian religion. Christian religion, if it is to be taken up, cannot be justified by presuppositions which are given outside of it. It has its justification, validity, and truth in itself, namely in the transparent use of the religious memory of Jesus Christ for the communication of religion. This inner functioning of the Christian religion as religion, or the knowledge of the Christian religion to be religion, is a subject as well as an object of systematic theology. It describes the Christian religion from its self-view, that is, from the perspective of those who practice the Christian religion. But theology is not itself religion. Fundamental for the modern Protestant theology, also for Tillich, is that theology as a science distinguishes itself from the religion to which it refers. The distinction between theology and religion is a distinction which is made in theology in order to release religion from the theological tutelage over its autonomy. When systematic theology refers to the Christian religion, it can do so only against the background of the distinction between the two. This means that the concept of religion in systematic theology is a theological construct. Theology constructs in itself an image of the Christian religion, which at the same time it distinguishes itself from. Only in this way can theology be an autonomous science and take into account in itself the autonomy of religion. Both are revoked if theology understands itself as an outflow or extension of religion into science, or as the truth of religion. Systematic theology constructs Christian religion in its own right. It cannot refer to religion in any other way, but it constructs the self-view of the Christian religion, its inner functioning as religion. What does this mean for the task of a systematic theology? Systematic theology describes the self-view of the Christian religion by constructing it as a self-referential and structured communication event that knows itself. As a religion, Christian religion arises, as already mentioned, in that the religious memory of Jesus Christ handed down in culture is appropriated by people in an understanding way as religion and is used to represent religion. Exactly this, the functioning as religion, symbolizes the contents of the Christian religion in it. The Holy Spirit represents in the Christian religion its lasting dependence on the memory of Jesus Christ. God represents the binding of the Christian religion to the understanding of communication, and Christ represents the necessity of the symbolic representation of the Christian religion. These representational contents of the Christian religion, which exists as religious contents in religion alone, thus do not have a representational function, but a reflexive one. They symbolize in the Christian religion how it functions as religion and is passed down in history, namely only in such a way that it hangs as religion on the understanding, appropriation, and articulation of the handed down religious memory of Jesus Christ. In order to be able to grasp the Christian religion theologically, systematic theology must describe how the Christian religion comes into being together with its contents in Christian religious communication. For religion cannot be sufficiently recognized by its contents. Religious contents, such as God, Christ, or the Holy Spirit, can be used in communication at any time in a non-religious sense, namely historically, aesthetically, politically, and so on. The religious quality of the communicated contents depends solely on their use and not on the contents as such. This was already seen by Tillich, for he ties the transition from the cultural use of communication to the religious communication to an act in consciousness. But the general foundational function of consciousness tapped in this act, which Tillich presupposes, is to be abandoned. For its function consists solely in asserting the universality of religion. Rather, the Christian religion comes into being in that the handed down memory of Jesus Christ is used religiously by people. That is, religion is meant, intended by it. This means that the communicated contents in religion lose their cultural meaning. This is negated, as it is said by Tillich, and thereby become the expression of religion. Consequently, the religiousness of the Christian religion does not depend on its content statements, but on its religious use. Nevertheless, the content of the Christian religion, namely the memory of Jesus Christ as it is transmitted by the Bible, does not become meaningless. For as a Christian religion, it can be recognized solely by its content statements. This is a function of the Bible in the Christian religion. Only by being tied to the medially conveyed memory of Jesus Christ is Christian religion, religious communication identifiable in culture. However, the fact that it is a religion and is not based on its contextual statements, but exclusively on the religious use of these statements, that is, on their religious meaning. What does this mean for the project of a theology of culture? A theology of culture can no longer be concerned, as it was with Tillich, with providing the true justification of culture, or even a justification or basis for cultural and religious pluralism. The plural and differentiated culture, no cultural system is able to do this, not even religion. Rather, a theology of culture must make it possible to recognize cultural and religious pluralism. However, this is only possible if it limits the Christian religion to itself. The otherness and autonomy of culture can be taken into account by systematic theology only if it does not assert Christian religion as a true and proper basis of culture or pluralism. Theology refers only to Christian religion. However, this is lived in a plural culture and society. This means that at any time in the cultural this means that at any time in the culture, traditional religious contents are used in a non-religious sense. But in the same way, conversely, the Christian religion constantly incorporates cultural content into Christian religious communication. In this way, these contents lose their cultural meaning. For in the Christian religion into which these contents are incorporated, they function as an expression and representation of the Christian religion. The Christian religion exists in history only as a self-description that is subject to a permanent change. This takes place in reference back to the memory of Jesus Christ and its reinterpretation in a highly differentiated culture, which helps to decide what is a plausible contemporary self-description of Christianity as religion. In this process of self-description does not lie a fixed identity of the Christian religion that remains constant as a core through the changing times, while the outer shell changes. Such a view of the Christian religion is an abstraction. Rather, Christian religion changed in history as a whole, just as its understanding of itself as a religion also changes. Christianity becomes different in every time and in every cultural context. Its identity consists solely in the reverence back to Jesus Christ and the religious use of his memory. To discuss this, that is to make possible the change in the self-description of the Christian religion and a recognition of plurality, is a task of a systematic theology of culture in the 21st century. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Professor Christian Danz, for your amazing and highly challenging lecture. We will now move on to a moment of reaction to your lecture. This reaction will be done first by me and then by Professor Dr. Jonas Roos. I take the opportunity to greet some of my friends and colleagues from the University of Vienna who are with us in this Brazilian morning, like Mr. Lee and my dearest friend, Dr. Christopher Arnold, a Schelling genius. So I'm going to try and make some brief observations on the fundamental aspects you point out in your presentation. More precisely, I'm going to focus on the criticism of Tillich's theology of culture, leaving the description of the structure of Tillich's Cultura theology aside. That was the topic of our first lecture. The substance of your lecture is extremely concise and difficult to delineate. Nonetheless, the overall intention of your presentation is rather clear. It has to do with a new systematic foundation for a theology of culture in the 21st century. And here all the difficulties arise. But, as Hölderlin said, where the danger lies also grows the saving power. Wo aber Gefahr ist, wächst das Rettende auch. So I'm gonna share my text on the screen, so that you and our audience may accompany my reading. You start your presentation with a brief description of the structure of this theology of culture. Although it is very brief and concise on the one hand, it is extremely precise on the other. This already shows your remarkable power of synthesis. The structure of Tillich's theology of culture can be only grasped by those of us who are familiar with its foundational concepts and the historical development of his thinking. Even so, your presentation was able to synthesize Tillich's theology of culture in a way that was very conducive to our interests. Despite the relevance of Tillich's thinking, his concept of religion is, according to the main thesis advanced in your lecture, in need of revision. And there are at least three aspects that need to be criticized and reconstructed in a highly different manner. Given that religion is Richtung auf das Unbedingte, i.e., directness towards the unconditioned, or, as the formula reads, das was uns unbedingt angeht, its universality is already presupposed. The determination of a universal concept of religion is the first point that needs to be reevaluated. Whenever religion happens, it happens always as an event of self-reflexivity that brings the self-discloseness of consciousness to its inner transparency and historicity. In this manner, however different and plural they might be, every religion finds its foundation in the same dimension of unconditionality of consciousness. Religious differences are restricted, therefore, to its symbolic self-interpretations. They are different only insofar they make use of different symbolic expressions. Religious symbols, by its turn, are means by which consciousness grasps and presents its self-disclosedness and unconditionality in its inner historicity and reflexivity. In other words, the same foundational structure, namely the unconditioned, underlies every particular religion. In this sense, the plurality of religious phenomena seems to be evaded only so far its unverifiable common ground is presupposed. The inner core that remains is, however, the same. Only the shell, as you said, that is, the historical actualization of religious phenomena, changes. The second difficulty stemming from Tillich's determination of the concept of religion on the basis of the self-relation of the spirit, i.e., the unconditionality of self-relation, lies on the fact that religion functions here as the unit of the self-differentiated modern culture. The systemic self-differentiation process of modern culture into different subsystems, as Nicholas Luhmann describes, is, so to say, overcome by means of an appeal to the unconditioned ground of reality as the unity of the whole culture. Tillich conceives of religion as an event of self-reflexivity that takes place in the spirit and consequently in the meaning functions of the spirit. This event dissolves the notion of religion as a particular form of meaning alongside others. By means of this determination of the concept of religion as an event of self-reflexivity that happens in the cultural functions of consciousness, Tillich is able to establish a new theonomous culture that glosses over the differences of autonomous religious systems as cultural forms on their own. Given that the unconditioned cannot be determined without being at the same time negated in its unconditionality, then it follows that the autonomous determinacy of religions as autonomous forms of meaning has to be negated in their conditionality. The double negation intrinsic to the concept of the unconditioned is thus programmatic. It aims to assume the autonomous forms of culture only insofar they are negated in their very autonomous self-determinations. The unity of culture is thus secured. Nonetheless, it has its price, for the unity of culture lies precisely in the negation of its particularity and unconditionality. The third difficulty has to do with the autonomous self-interpretation and self-presentation of human being. Bear in mind that the unconditioned underlines, as you said, every consciousness, and that the unconditioned is the foundational basis from which the concept of religion is constructed. A non-religious mode of self-interpretations is always and necessarily a self-interpretation that has not yet become transparent in relation to its unconditional dimension. It is, therefore, a self-interpretation that, despite its autonomous self-determination, remains, as you said, deficient. The unconditioned judgment turns against it. That is, it remains a normative reference that calls into question a non-religious self-interpretation, insofar as it asserts itself as non-religious. And autonomous self-interpretation is always inferior when compared to a religious symbolic self-interpretation. A true self-interpretation has to be a religious one, because only in religion the self-disclosedness of the unconditional dimension of consciousness is brought to its transparency. Religion is therefore the locus of every true self-interpretation, and apart from it there is no possible self-transparency. The necessary result of these difficulties outlined in your lecture lies on the fact that Tillich's theology of culture is, ironically, not able to recognize the pluralism that is intrinsic to modern culture. In this sense, how are we supposed to assume the task of a theology of culture under the conditions of modern pluralism? The first step is, of course, to give up building any concept of religion that claims to be universal. Against Tillich's insistence on the claim that religion cannot be conceived of as a particular function of the spirit alongside others' functions, the concept of religion is to be understood as an autonomous form in culture. Religion is, in other words, not necessary to the modern man. But does it mean that the concept of religion as such is scientifically useless? That certainly is not the position advanced in your lecture. Rather, the concept of religion needs to be restricted to Christianity, since it is a Christian and particularly Neo-Protestant construction. The function of the concept of religion within the theological system lies in its ability of, I quote you, conceptually grasp and determine Christianity as religion. As you said, by renouncing a general concept of religion, the possibility is created to recognize that other religions understand religion differently than Christianity. Thus, it is not a matter of distinguishing only Christianity as a religion or of understanding it as a true and proper religion, but just the other way around, to include in theology and to acknowledge that what is religion is already differently determined in the different religions. Each religion is a religion sui generis, and not merely the historical particularization of a general underlying essence that they allegedly have in common. End of quotation. The alternative is conceived of religion, that is, religion understood as a concept that needs to be restricted to Christianity and its conceptual self-interpretation as a form of communication. To be sure, religion cannot be understood here as a simple form of communication. Rather, religion is religious communication, that is, a communication which is aware of being a religious form of communication. Religion communicates religion in its contextual communication. The circular character of the human sciences is thus secured. Here I would like to make a reference to the circularity of the Geisteswissenschaften that is referred to by Tillich in a very precise manner in his hermeneutical circle, as advanced above all in his dogmatics from Marburg and Dresden from the years of 1925 and 1927. In this work, Tillich says that history is not an objective empirical process that somehow already exists or would be given regardless of the subject interpreting history. Tillich expressly rejects such a cum grano salis scientific view of history as inadequate. Rather, history only arises through an act of interpretation. It is set or cancelled with the decision for or against it, and apart from this setting, it has no objective being. The dependence of history on interpretation emphasized by Tillich is only one aspect of his understanding of history. In addition, there is a second but no less important aspect, the historical determination of the interpretation itself. The setting of history is not a subjective act, but, and I quote Tillich, something historical in itself and only possible on the basis of a historical grasp. The interpretation of the history is already part of a history that is determined in terms of content and is determined by this very history. This mixture of being determined by a history and the dependence of history on interpretation becomes transparent in faith. That is why, for Tillich, faith is the event in which knowledge of history arises. The historical hermeneutical circle, which is already laid out in every interpretation of history, must find its expression in dogmatic Christology. This is precisely the systematic content of Tillich's understanding of the biblical image of Christ. So I made this rather long excursus in order to bring this circularity of the human sciences that you have appropriated into your system. So religion does not arise by means of preconditions given outside the religious system of communication, like the attempt at offering a transcendental foundation of the concept of religion claims. I quote you, "Constitutive for the Christian religion is an interrelation of three structural elements. First, it depends on Christian religious communication, i.e., the memory of Jesus Christ, which must already exist in culture. Second, Christian religion depends on the understanding appropriation, verstehende Aneignung, on the memory of Jesus Christ. And third, on the symbolic articulation of the appropriated memory of Jesus Christ. As a religion, Christian religion arises alone from all three moments together. It cannot be traced back or justified on one of these elements. Only by people taking up the Christian religious communication as religion and using it for the representation of religion, the Christian religion exists." End of quotation. Religion as communication brings with itself a normative element. It depends exclusively on the use that people make of the communication. As a self-referential, self-aware, self-structured communication, Christian religion only exists as a closed system of communication that makes use of the contents of Christian traditions religiously. Outside religious communication, there is no Christian religion, and that which determines the religious character of communication lies entirely in its use. Just a quick note on the idea of closed system. The self-referentiality of the system is clear, for instance, in Tillich's systematic theology of 1913. In this text, Tillich develops the critique of the system as a constitutive part of the system. Tillich calls this part of systematic theology reflection, and it reveals the systemic function of the concept of paradox that is so central to his systematic theological sketch, as well his concept of religion. Another example here is advanced by Moltmann. For instance, Moltmann, with the idea of open systems, takes up the debate of the 70s in order to bring theology and natural sciences into a new conversation. Moltmann's position on this debate, however, remains highly undercomplex and beholden to his own theological intentions as he uses it, that is, the idea of open systems, to distinguish and contrast open and closed systems. But as Moltmann himself partially acknowledges in his book on the doctrine of creation, a system can only be open if it is fully self-referential, and that means a closed system. In the transparent use of the religious memory of Jesus Christ for the communication of religion, Christianity describes its own self-image. It is the task of systematic theology to construct a self-image of the Christian religion from which it, theology, at the same time, distinguishes itself. Theology assumes the religious use of communications and constructs this very communication as self-referential and self-structured event that is aware of itself as religion. The functioning of religious communication and its comprehensive appropriation symbolizes the contents of religion in its religious use. The Trinitarian structure of Christian religious communication is clear in the presentation of your system. The Holy Spirit represents in the Christian religion its last dependence on the memory of Jesus Christ. God represents the binding of the Christian religion to the understanding of communication, and Christ represents the necessity of the symbolic representation of the Christian religion. The representational contents of the Christian religion, which exists as religious contents in religion alone, thus do not have a representational function, but a reflexive one, emphasis mine. They symbolize in the Christian religion how it functioned as religion and is passed down in history, namely only in such a way that it hangs as religion on the understanding, appropriation, and articulation of the handed down religious memory of Jesus Christ. End of quotation. Thus, it is in the use of the religious communication that the contents of Christian religion can be differentiated from other cultural communications. If the contents of religions are used by politics, for instance, as is the case in Brazil, especially in Brazil, they are no longer religious contents insofar as they make use of political communication. In this sense, the use of religious communication dissolves the contents of Christian religion as particular cultural contents. It claims them for itself. In this sense, the task of systematic theology is to describe how Christian religion comes into being together with its contents in Christian religious communication. The way is thus open for the establishment of a hermeneutics of differences as the primary concern of any theological critical reflection. On the other hand, a criterion for the task of the discrimination of the gods is also offered. This criterion is the acknowledgement of the difference amongst religions. That is to say, a religious system of communication that does not acknowledge the difference amongst religions is not to be tolerated. I will finish my remarks here. However, one thing remains unclear to me, and my questions, they are intertwined. How does the Verständigung happen? What does it mean to appropriate the religious contents as religious contents and not as something else? Is theology still a form of self-interpretation, which, in this case, would make use of religious communication religiously? If the answer is affirmative, that is, if theology is still a form of self-interpretation, is it not true to say that in the comprehensive appropriation, the inner structure of the reflexive subjectivity resonates? Finally, given that religious communication finds its norms in its religious use, how are we supposed to deal with a religious communication that claims to be in touch with that which is ultimately true? Are we truly able to avoid the truth claims of Christian religion, which, as such, have to be true not only for Christians, but for the totality of humanity? On the other hand, given the primacy of religious communication both for Christian religion and Christian theology, what use should we make of concepts so dear to the Christian faith, such as experience and conversion? In other words, does it not belong to Christian religion and other religions to say that a non-religious mode of self-interpretation is always and necessarily a self-interpretation that has not yet become transparent in relation to its unconditional dimension? After all, is the call to conversion that shapes every system of religious communication a constitutive part of that system, or is it not? I thank you very much for your wonderful lecture, Professor Danz. And for a Lutheran liberal theologian as myself, so accustomed to conceive of religion by means of a transcendental foundation, your system challenged me to rethink my whole theological training, but also, for what that matters, the form and the substance of my habilitation research as well. Thank you very much again.
Thank you so much for your presentation and for your comments to my paper. Should I answer now to your questions or later?
You can proceed right now.
Okay, thank you so much for your comments, and I think the main points of your presentation, of my presentation, are correct. But and I agree with you with your description of my position, which I explain in the following to Tillich. Let me only say three things. The first is the point is religion a necessary moment in the structure of human beings. I rejected this. And I mean not only the modern man, I mean human being as such. Religion is a result of the cultural evolution process, and maybe sometimes we have no religion. This is one point. But your main questions are what happens in the understanding appropriation, and what is with the truth of the Christian religion or other religion, and what is with the side other religions or other people, of non-religious people, are they not all sinners? Your last sentence. This is a consequence, right? Good. First, I make a strong differentiation between theology and religion. I mentioned this short in the last chapter of my paper. This is significant for the modern Protestant theology since Enlightenment, to make a differentiation between theology as a science and religion. Religion can only practice individual people, and the question is, since Enlightenment, how is the relation between the science of religion, namely theology, and religion on the other side, and how is this relation to understand? Switch the religion in the science, but how could this be possible? Or on the other side, and this is very dominant in the theological tradition, is knows the theology the truth of the religion. Yeah? And what I say is, we must make a differentiation. All what theology say, or systematic theology says about religion, is a construction. Every science, studies of religion, sociology of religion, psychology of religion, and what else? They only can only construct the religion. They are never on the point of the religious practice of the religious in the world. They all are science differentiated, and so the theology is an autonomous science if it is self-referential. You mentioned this in the debate with Jürgen Moltmann. An open system, you say it is only possible if you have a closed system. Yeah? And also, theology is autonomous if it gives an own description of the religion in its own right. Yeah? And this is a construction which is distinguished from the religion which the people live. So the only thing but the difference, I say all sciences which have to do with religion can only construct the religion, her object. But theology constructs the self-view of the religion, and this means theology must understand and describe how function religion as religion, and exactly this. But this is only a construction of the theology for description of religion. So, insofar, theology constructs always in its own right a view or image, but this view must be, or this knowledge of religion, the knowledge of the functioning of religion, must be also a part of the religion itself, because religion is in modernity an autonomous subsystem in the society or in the culture. Yeah? And if it is autonomous, it must know that it is autonomous. Yeah? So this is the one side. The other side is your last sentence or your last remarks. What is with the truth of religion and other religions and so on? This is a problem which is the problem of other religions. It's not a problem of the religion itself. This is a problem of theology. It is on a different level. But on the level of the religion, it is, I think, if you go, or the background or the condition for this is the understanding of modernity and the development of modernity. You must always have an image how is the development of the modern society, of the modern culture. And if you go out from a model which works with differentiation, like Luhmann and others, so you can say modern societies and modern cultures are characterized by the fact that many different cultural systems like economics, law, politics, religion, arts, and so on stand side by side. And every religious people, every human beings who, for example, pray, knows that they do a religious act, and they know every time that side by side this religion are different different cultural systems. This means that the knowledge about the particularity of religion is a part of religion every time in modernity. Yeah? And insofar, also religion must acknowledge and recognize that religion is only a part, a view of the world, side by side, other views of the world. Yeah? You can say, like in your last sentence, but the Christ or the religious view is the very right view and the true view of the world. Okay, but then you are in Afghanistan by the Taliban. And not in a democratic society. My third and last remark is you are right in but this, I think, thank you, this is a problem. It is a view from which is typical for a European or a Western or Northern view of the world. Namely, it presupposes the differentiation between religion and non-religion. And this is a result of the evolution process of culture, for example, in Western Europe. Yeah? In all other parts of the world, South America, Asia, Africa, is this system a product of colonialism, yeah? And not of the self. Insofar, the things I would say are a further step complicated if you take up this, that I speak about the concept of religion, which is a result of the social development in Europe and on the religious development in Europe. Yeah? And for this concept of religion is a differentiation between religion and non-religion constitutive. This is not the case in other parts of the world. And so we have also in Christianity different understandings of Christianity and what is religion. Yeah? And the last thing, what is this conversation and religious experience? What I say is a religious experience is not the foundation of religion. Religious experience and conversations also happens, but they happen only in the Christian religion and not outside. Yeah? This is a result of we have a clear, my remarks are connected with theological and philosophical development in the 19th and 20th century. I presuppose the critique of enlightenment on the pre-modern theology and the change to religion as a basic concept of theology around 1800 by Schleiermacher and others. But I also include the critique on an anthropological foundation of religion, like an experience from the theology of the beginning of the 20th century. And insofar, what I present to you is a result of the theological development since Schleiermacher. Good. I hope I have answered your question insofar.
Yeah. Thank you very much. I'm gonna give the floor, so to say, to Professor Dr. Jonas Roos for him to make his contribution in reaction to your lecture as well, and then we will open the questions from the audience and from the members of the Brazilian Paul Tillich Society. Thank you, Professor Jonas Roos.
Thank you, Professor Danz, for your thought-provoking text and to the opportunity to react to it. I will make a few questions that, as you will see, are connected somehow. So, as we heard from your presentation, you seek both thinking in a line that is in depth to Tillich and, at the same time, facing specific issues of our plural 21st century. This challenge is related specifically to the difficulty of maintaining a general concept of religion, as Tillich does, in the face of the plurality of our 21st century. I quote from your presentation, Tillich's own foundation of theology of culture on the basis of a general concept of religion cannot be continued under the conditions of a pluralistic culture and society. Rather, it must be replaced by a conception that pays more attention to the differences and distinctions of religions. Only in this way can a theology of culture be elaborated under the conditions of the present times, which then, of course, also acquires a quite different function from that developed by Tillich himself. End of quote. I think that when talking about a general concept of religion regarding Tillich, we must keep in mind that, as we know, Tillich always tried to think in terms of a system. Even if his system is different from that of Hegel, for example, where, at least according to Kierkegaard's critique, concepts are articulated by necessity, what generates a qualitative difference from existence and actuality. Even if Tillich's idea is far from that, or at least different from that, the way he approaches a problem will always have implications for many other problems or issues. The consequence of this is that a change in one point is obviously reflected in many others. This necessarily raises the question of how far it remains possible to keep thinking on Tillichian terms while dropping some of his concepts. What do we gain and what do we lose in following this path? Of course, this question I raised does not imply that one should not try doing this. In relation to thinking a concept of religion, in contrast to Tillich, you state, I quote, "My proposal is to understand the Christian religion as an independent form of communication in culture, which knows about itself as religion and communicates religion in its contentual communication." End of quote. It is inherent to the role of theology to take in consideration our contextual problems. When thinking theologically, taking into consideration the situation of some European countries, for example, it is necessary to deal with a large and growing number of people who declare themselves as atheists. As you said, it is not it is not something that is restricted to European countries nowadays, but it is related to human beings as such. Anyway, for this context, a general concept of religion can be something difficult to manage, or at least for this context. But it is, of course, not less true that, for example, in our Brazilian context, our challenge is very much focused on thinking religion in the face of idolatry and the demonic. This is not a new problem, of course, but it certainly became much more intense in Brazil under Bolsonaro and what he represents. Thinking religion in this context, in the light of Tillich's Protestant principle, for example, has been not only fruitful, but necessary. The same can be said about the concepts of idolatry or the demonic. However, here we have to ask up to which point these concepts are dependent on Tillich's general concept of religion. Can we drop his concept of religion and keep these important concepts? Are not they dependent on ideas that are correlated to Tillich's concept of religion, such as ultimate concern? Related to that, if religion is thought as a communication, what criteria does it provide for a critique of religion? Finally, if we replace Tillich's concept of religion and, I quote, in its place an understanding of the Christian religion as a self-referential, self-aware, and self-structured communication event takes place, end of quote, to what extent can Christianity maintain its prophetic role, not only for an internal and self-referential discourse, but in relation to society as a whole? So these are my questions, and yes, thank you for the opportunity of debating.
Thank you, Jonas, for your questions. I think it was three questions. First was the concept of religion, the general concept. What is the price if we drop out the general concept of religion? Second, the relation between the concept of religion and the context, namely, what are the criterion? What is the criterion for critique on religion? And thirdly, what is then the relation between theology and society? Let me start with the first question. Also, I would say the problem, I try to show the problem of a general concept of religion, namely all religions have the same core, namely maybe a part in the soul and this part or a part in the human being. And this is in all religions the same. And if you argue so, then are all religions religions, but the differences lies on the surface, namely the symbolic systems of the religions. I would say this we have a long tradition to understand in this way religion, namely since Enlightenment until today, namely in the debates of the pluralistic theology of religions and so on. But the problem is due the peculiarity of religion, the absoluteness of religion is dropped out in this concept. The Christian religion functions totally different as Judaism. Yeah? In the Christian religion is the focus on religion that's in the individual appropriation of the religion. Yeah? This is a central part in the Christian religion. For this stands in the Christian religion the doctrine of Christology, or Jesus Christ. Yeah? This means this is not the case in Judaism. In Judaism, God remains transcendent and is not part of the individual religious views. Und insofern, with the establishment or the arising of Christianity, sure, Jesus was a Jew and all the early Christians was Jews. Yeah? But from this starting point, from the differentiation, arises a totally different understanding of religion. That means that Jesus Christ is not a new element in the concept of religion, in the general concept of religion. Yeah? If you argue with the general concept of religion, you must say the Jews and the Christians have the same God. One have no Christ, other have, the Christians have Jesus as a Christ. Yeah? But so I think you couldn't understand that both religion have have self different understandings of this, what a religion is. Yeah? And my proposal is not to go out from different religions, but from different understandings of religion. Yeah? This is a reason for the dropping out of a general concept of religion. You see it in the debate. This is not a problem of Tillich. You see it in the pluralistic model of theology of religions, for example, by John Hick. Yeah? All what happens in the religion plays no rule. Yeah? The concreteness, the symbol systems are irrelevant. The only relevant moment is the transition from self-centeredness to the centeredness of the real. Yeah? And this is in all religions the same, whatever they say. Yeah? But this means that the surface is irrelevant. Yeah? And I think this is not very helpful for the discourse of the understanding of religion. Your second question was connected with this, namely, what is with the critique of religion, of the daimonic, of superstition, and so on? I think I mentioned in the end, and you are totally right, in my paper, I mentioned this only. And the point is, the criterion is the self-relatedness of religion. This means that all what is said in religion is religious and not political. Yeah? If you transfer, or if you use religious language, for example, God or other contents, if you use this for politics, then you do not religion. It's not to do with religion. This is one point. The second point is, and I mentioned this not so direct, but Fábio in his comments mentions this. The point is, a religious system, although different understandings of Christianity, must recognize that there are different understandings of religion. And if there are religious systems or Christian religion confessions which not tolerate or which not accept that there are different understandings of human being or of non-religious being or of different understandings of Christianity, that must be criticized. Also this if you want, the concept of religion is not only a description of religion, it is a normative concept of religion. And the normativity of religion lies in the religious use of communication or of the religious contents. And if you use these contents in politics or as politics, this has nothing to do with religion. Yeah? This would be my answer to the second question. The third, what is the relation for theology for society? We have a long tradition in Europe and also in the world that religion plays a central role for the integration of society. This is a model from the 19th century, and this is connected not with democratic societies and pluralistic societies. And in this old traditional models, this is a consequence that Christianity is sozusagen in the pre-modern age, the only one religion which plays a role in Europe. And in so far, we find it until the 19th century that religion plays a central part, and also theology explains the world for the government or for the society. This is, I would say, in a contemporary society, not possible at all. Theology is one part of the system of the science, of the Wissenschaftssystem, system of science. Is theology a part? And theology is not the truth of religion. Yeah? Theology describes how Christian religion functions. And this is connected with the question from Fábio. I think the Christian religion and also theology must restrict himself on the Christian religion. This is, I think, different to we have the debate in theology until the 1980s, Moltmann, Pannenberg, and others. These theologians from the second half of the 20th century, they all have the opinion and the conviction they could explain the world to the rest of the world. But I think in our times, nobody thinks that is right. Nobody accepts this. Yeah? We discuss about religion. And I think theology can only play a role, and constructive role, for society and for culture if systematic theology is able to interpret the Christian religion. And this means not only the images in which, or the contents of the Christian religion. Theology must explain how the Christian religion functions as religion. Yeah? And not only the contents. The contents are very different. Also, what is Christian religion? The understanding of Jesus Christ in the different Christianities of the world are very different and not the same like in Europe or in the old European dogmatics from the Savior of the world. In many parts of the world and in many growing parts of Christianity, like in Brazil or Asia or Africa, Jesus is a chief or a witchcraft or what else. Yeah? The point is not the pictures in which the Christian religion describes himself. These pictures must always be plausible pictures for the practitioners of this religion. Theology must explain how is the inner function of the religion. Yeah? And this is a function also, and if systematic theology works in this way, then it gives a constructive explanation of religion, and is, I would say, quite up to date. But we live in a very complex world and a very differentiated world, and nobody knows what is the right interpretation of the word. Also, theologians do not know what this is. I hope I could answer your questions.
Yes, thank you very much.
Okay, I'm put here on the screen, so I think I should make my question. Yes? Eu coloquei a minha questão no YouTube em português, tá? Eu vou colocar aqui em inglês para o professor. Aliás, são duas questões. Eu vou fazer uma pequena complementação a uma. So I will read the question here in English, and in YouTube it is in Portuguese too. The first question is, transcendental conception of religion has the disadvantage of allowing an escape from history, albeit, this is my opinion, this is not the case of Tillich's intention. But it also enables to recognize the limitations of particular historical conception. How does a linguistic historical conception proposes to avoid an accommodation in a self-sufficient particularism of a given tradition? This is my first question. I think from what I have heard in the reactions to the former other speeches, I wish to put two more elements here. One is about the autonomy of the spheres. I think not all religions agree with this modern view, and I think it's a view that is very comfortable for us in the Protestant tradition of the autonomy of spheres or realms. For example, the autonomy between religion and politics, or religion and art. I can agree with this totally, but most Muslims and our fundamentalist Christians here in Brazil and in the United States does not agree with this autonomy of spheres. So I think this is one problem for this idea that it is possible to renounce the element of universality in the conception of religion. I don't know. And another thing that I would add to this question is that I also agree that theology is not religion, but also religion is not understandable without theology, at least not Christian religion, where theology plays a big role in religion itself. So this is my first question. The second one is a question about the interpretation of the term symbols in Tillich's thought. Are symbols really only illustrations of the general for Tillich? Are they not necessary cultural precondition of anything general? Is the general for him not only an abstraction of the historical, or has it really a reality for itself? These are my questions. I thank you very much for your speech, and also for Fábio and Jonas for their reactions. It's a very nice day to hearing your speeches today. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you, Eduardo, for your questions. The first one, I think this is not so. What I mean is the concept of religion is to restrict to Christianity and to reject an universal anthropological concept of religion, because such a universal concept dissolves differences. And the result is we cannot acknowledge differences in religions. But from this follows not, it is not the same like the old model from Lindbeck. From, I forget the name, Lindbeck, from the US, the nature of doctrine. This is not the same. I go out that the concept of religion is to restrict to the Christian religion. And on the other side, to use religion as a placeholder. But this placeholder is not determined. And so far, I go not out from a strong isolation between the religions. We are all humans, we can understand us. But this understanding and the finding of common things must be a result of a dialogue and not a presupposition. Yeah? This is the point. Yeah? And in so far, but I say it to the question from Jonas and also from Fábio, a general concept has a problem, namely to lose the peculiarity and from religions, from concrete historical religions. Particularity doesn't mean particularity. Yeah? I would say, sure, Christianity is a universal religion, but I would go out from an understanding of that what is universality as a reflexive category, and not a substantial category. Sure, Christian religious communication does not depend on something. You could always use it, and you need no preconditions for this. Yeah? Every man and every woman in the world can practice the Christian religion. And in this sense, sure, Christian religion is a universal religion. Yeah? But I think not in the old sense of the world religions from the 19th century. The second question from you, indeed, I think you are totally right. The view of religion which I presented is from a liberal Protestant Lutheran position. But we have no possibility to give other description of religion. Yeah? Descriptions of religion are always circular. Yeah? Sure, we could make this clear that we give this interpretation, but we can only give it, if we say it different, we must switch in a different tradition and so on. And I would say this is a point which you mentioned, Brazil, or other places of Christianity in the whole world or in the so-called majority world. I think they have very different understandings of this, what is Christianity. Yeah? And I would say, also for me, it is a great research field in the next years. Then my thesis was to restrict the concept of religion on Christian religion. And I say Christian religion functions as a religion understanding of communication, which is always related, is only related to religion. Yeah? But the question is, for me, is this concept to transfer to Christianity in South America or Africa or Asia? Because I mentioned this in my answer to Jonas. This distinction is a part of the expansion of the European world in the 15th, 16th century. Also all the debates about post-colonialism and so on include these questions. Have not Christianity very different understandings of what is religion? And not only different religions like Judaism, Islam, and others have different understandings of religion. Has not Christianity in itself very different understanding of that what is religion is? Namely, for example, the liberation theology in South America connects very strong salvation with the political dimension. This means this separation from which I speak, namely the differentiation between politics and or economics, which is constitutive for European, is dropped in this understanding of religion, because this is an expansion of the European traditions of the white man from Europe. They introduce this distinction, but this is not our own view. And I think at this point, I'm totally right. Here must begin, although for me, to thinking about how is this to understand in the 21st century. If we go out from a pluralistic concept of religion, it is not always the same. You see, always in Christianity, we have very different understandings of Christianity. And we couldn't only say this is a wrong understanding of Christianity. This is, I would say, problematic. And the third question, symbols. Yes, the symbol is, also, I think, Tillich's understanding of symbols. I mentioned this in my paper in the short summary on the first part. Symbols doesn't mean by Tillich to refer to something. He has not a referential system understanding of symbols. Sure, on the other side, Tillich speaks every time, especially in the United States, from pointing out and so on. But I think this is not quite correct. The concept of symbols, or the foundation of his theory of symbols is a concept of religion which I present to you. And this means, and I think this is an important point, and this connects Tillich with his contemporaries, Karl Barth, Friedrich Gogarten, Bultmann, and others, that religion is self-related construct. This means the religious act is a central category for the theologians. Religion is an act and not something what is given without acting in the human being. This act is related to himself, and the contents are expressions or pictures of this act. If the religious act is related to God, then he is related to the reflexivity to his own act. And this means that the symbol describes exactly this, namely the position between the consciousness and the image. And the differentiation is, the main point is the differentiation between cultural symbols and religious symbols. And this is a different position of the consciousness to its own contents. This is, I think, the core of the symbol, the theory of the symbols. This means always the consciousness is for Tillich always a symbol consciousness. This is the background, because he starts from the background of the Neo-Kantian debates and phenomenology around 1900 in Germany, and this is the background. And insofar, But this is also the debate and the difference between Ernst Cassirer's famous theory of philosophy of symbolic forms. That for Cassirer, religion is sozusagen one form side by side others. For Tillich, the religious symbols are expressions of the disclosedness of the consciousness, and insofar fundamental, and they introduce the unity in the different modern, differentiated modern culture. I hope I could answer your questions in a halfway sufficient way.
Thank you very much. Very, very good answer.
Well, we have now a question from Professor Calvani. It's written on the chat, but I'm going to read it. He first thanks you for your thought-provoking lecture, and he mentions that I mentioned in the opening of this conference your new book on the deities of seventh race by Schelling. And then he named that a Brazilian author named Euclides da Cunha wrote at the beginning of the 20th century, 1903, a book about an important millenarian messianic movement in northeast Brazil that provoked an armed war between rural workers, poor peasants, and the Brazilian army. This text begins with an extensive geological survey of the relevant region of Brazil in the manner of Schelling's deities of seventh race in a dates of seventh race. In a recent article on Tillich and Schelling, Professor Daniel Whistler from England suggested that geological crises are also crises of politics and religion. In them, the same concerns are revealed. Moreover, Euclides da Cunha explicitly invokes these links between politics, religion, and geology in the name of prophecy. His question, therefore, is, if that section of Systematic Theology, Volume 3, in which Tillich discusses the importance of the inorganic dimension of life, the energy expanded from earthquakes and I think he means tsunamis, for instance, can justify this relationship between geology, politics, and millenarism. He thanks you very much for and send you greetings and health wishes from Brazil. So the question is the importance of the inorganic dimension of life as a link that justify the relationship between geology, politics, and millenarism.
Yes, thank you very much for your question, and you also greetings from Europe. Yes, I think the point is that Tillich, I mentioned is it in the beginning of my lecture. Tillich starts from a universal concept of revelation. Yeah? And this is, I would say, he stands in the tradition of the modern positive theology. We have not much research, literature about Tillich and his academical teachers. Now we are working here in Vienna. Actually, Christopher Arnold, Fábio, you mentioned him in the beginning of our discussion. Christopher Arnold and I, we have now edited the deities from cemeteries, from Schelling, and this background, this plays for Schelling important role. But also on the other side, a doctoral student from me works on his dissertation about Schelling, Tillich and his academical teachers Schlatter and Lütgert. And this is not also a special version of his concept of religion, that he goes out, that the creation means not, or the religious notion of creation does not mean classification of the world as whole, like in the tradition of Schleiermacher. For Schleiermacher, in Schleiermacher's reformulation of the doctrine of creation is the notion of creation, classification of the world as whole. For Tillich, and also for these theologians, Schlatter, Lütgert, is the concrete, is the world as a whole, the creation of God, but every concrete in the world shows that is created by God. And this is also the conviction you can find in the theology of Tillich from the beginning, that he is convinced that God lies every concrete in the world, underlies every concrete in the world. If you refer to something concrete in the world, you refer implicit to God. And religion is the knowledge that you refer to God if you refer to the concrete. Yeah? This is the difference between religion and culture, and you find it all in the theology from Adolf Schlatter and also from Lütgert. And what I say in my paper, I couldn't only give some hints to it, but Tillich gives with the philosophy of Schelling and also with the philosophy of Fichte an epistemological critical foundation of this modern positive theology. Yeah? And what you find, there is no change in the whole work of Tillich in this point. This is always an act of disclosedness, is a revelation. And so is a concrete moment of the religious, moment of the creation. And this you find in your mentioned things in the parts of the systematic theology, part 3. Yeah? God underlies all in the world, yeah? And everything what is concrete. And from this starting point, he can easily connect politics and geology and other things. Yeah? Because religion is the deep, is not a special form. Religion is always a moment in the cultural consciousness. Yeah? Tillich explicitly rejects that religion is a concrete form. It is a moment in our cultural consciousness, yeah? And namely a reflexive consciousness. Yeah? This is the point. Yeah? And so he can connect the religious socialism from Tillich from the 20s. It's also an example for this, how he connects diverse dimensions. Yeah? And I would say this is questionable in the 21st century. And also Tillich sees as this has many to do with development in Germany after the World War I. Yeah? Tillich developed his theology not in a democratic society. He developed his theology in the German kingdom. Yeah? And this is a starting point. As he came in the United States, he was confronted with the democratic society, but not in Germany. And this is not, also in the writings in Germany, the background is not a democratic society. Yeah. I hope I could answer your questions.
Thank you very much, Professor Danz, for your presence. It was, like, as I said before, a huge honor for us to have you here. And now I would like to invite Professor Dr. Etienne Gué, the chairman of our Brazilian Paul Tillich Society, to make the closure of our event. Again, thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you so much for the discussion and your questions.
Então, eu, como o tempo já está bem adiantado, eu só gostaria de agradecer o professor Danz pela sua brilhante conferência. Ich danke Ihnen sehr herzlich, Herr Professor Danz, für Ihren so schönen Vortrag. Ich hatte Fragen, aber es gab keine Zeit und Sie haben sowieso schon geantwortet. Ich lasse die Fragen für später.
Yes, thank you so much.
Então, eu disse que eu teria tido também uma ou outra pergunta, mas essas perguntas, em parte, foram respondidas nas longas respostas do professor, e nós temos que pensar agora em descansar, no nosso caso, em almoçar, provavelmente, e eu acho que essas três conferências, que constituem agora o conjunto do nosso seminário, fora as comunicações, que ainda vão acontecer no quadro da UNTEC, representa uma boa contribuição para o tema da teologia da cultura de Tillich, uma contribuição polêmica, que pode suscitar no futuro, e eu acho, interessantes discussões que até a nossa associação poderia retomar e propor entre nós alguma discussão sobre um ou outro ponto, ou até sobre o conjunto da concepção do professor Danz, e também das pessoas que interviram depois. Então, eu agradeço, eu acho que foi uma boa conclusão para o nosso seminário, para a retomada do nosso seminário, que já tem uma longa história, mas que ficou interrompido pela força das circunstâncias durante também um certo tempo. E espero que agora em diante nós vamos poder enganchar a continuidade dos nossos encontros, e talvez programar um ou outro encontro a mais fora desse seminário anual. Em todo caso, já prever um seminário para o próximo ano, 2022. Seria muito importante continuar. Eu lembro também que existe ainda a nossa revista Correlácio, que espero que os textos poderão ser publicados nessa revista, inclusive o texto do professor Danz, talvez aí o Fábio se encarregaria de entrar em contato com ele para ver a forma como poderia ser publicado na nossa revista. E também, futuramente, as comunicações do GT. Então, nós falaremos futuramente da questão de retomar, quem sabe, a associação, as adesões à nossa sociedade, que estão parados há muito tempo, mas nós não temos ainda, no momento, acho que as condições materiais para poder iniciar isso. Eu acho que mandaremos notícias no futuro. Sempre preste também atenção no nosso site, eu acho que gostaria que fosse novamente alimentado, e, sobretudo, no Facebook, na nossa página do Facebook, é muito importante que nós possamos continuar nos comunicamos. Nós tivemos, há algum tempo atrás, uma interessante discussão sobre Ultimate Concern. Então, por que não retomar outras questões, até questão da teologia da cultura, no site do Facebook, na página do Facebook? Isso depende um pouco das iniciativas de nós, sobretudo da diretoria e das pessoas mais próximas da sociedade. Então, eu desejo a todos vocês uma excelente continuação do dia, um bom almoço, e espero que possamos encontrar novamente no site da Amtec durante esse congresso. O congresso da Amtec ainda não deu muita informação sobre o modo como serão realizadas as comunicações, então é preciso acompanhar o nosso site e também o site da própria Amtec. E eu lembro que para poder participar da Amtec, mesmo como ouvinte, é preciso se inscrever na própria Amtec. Então, muito obrigado a todos e a todas. Eu percebi nos comentários do YouTube que teve uma razoável participação, e agradeço mais uma vez e um bom dia a todos.